To say that the 4 years that John Adams served as president were tumultuous would be an understatement. In 1797, President Adams will send a diplomatic envoy to France to try to negotiate through some issues that had been taking place on the open sea, primarily the French seizures of American ships and the impressment of American sailors. However, before they could even arrive to speak with French officials, they're met by 3 French agents. Later on, we'll know them as Agent X, Agent Y, and Agent Z. These 3 agents are going to require bribe payments or loans to even have the ability to speak with French officials. When word of this demand reached the American public, there was outrage. The slogan, "Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute," became the rallying cry. The XYZ affair is going to lead to a lot of anti-French sentiment and will eventually push the United States into an undeclared naval conflict with France on the open sea. This conflict, known as the Quasi-War, was fought between 1798 and 1800. U.S. Navy and privateers engaged French Navy, trying to protect American commerce as well as protecting U.S. maritime rights. Now, Adams is going to be pressured severely by his own party, especially the Hamiltonians, to escalate this into a full-scale declared war. But Adams does not want to do that. Adams is sharing the same neutral foreign policy that Washington had and is going to try to do everything he can to bring this conflict to a resolution. This decision to pursue peace over prolonged conflict was a double-edged sword for Adams. While it did bring an end to the Quasi-War with the Convention of 1800 and eventually improved relations with the French, it also deepened the rifts that already existed within the Federalist Party, especially with those in the Hamiltonian camp. And to make matters worse, Adams is going to fire 2 of his cabinet members who are pretty much Hamiltonians, Timothy Pickering and James McHenry, who disagreed with his policies, so Adams got rid of them. And with this as our backdrop, in today's episode, we're going to look at arguably the most contentious election in American history, the rematch between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Let's get started. The division within Adams' own party was just the tip of the iceberg. The rift that existed between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans was getting wider by the day. And a lot of the division came over Adams' policies. Things like the raising of a standing army, the additional new taxes that the Federalists instituted during Adams' administration, and lastly, as we mentioned last episode, the institution of the Alien and Sedition Acts. And a lot of the disdain from the Democratic Republican Party stems from the Sedition Act. And if you remember from last episode, we talked about how the Sedition Act was an attempt by the Federalist Party to silence the dissent that existed in the United States over Federalist policies, including the foreign policy to get involved in an undeclared naval conflict with the French. Thomas Jefferson is adamant that this must be repealed. And he even goes as far as to suggest secession. Before a group of Virginian Democratic Republicans, Jefferson will say this: "The true principles of our federal compact left the states sovereign from domestic policy, and if Congress refused to repeal the Sedition Act," Jefferson said, "we should sever ourselves from that union which we so much value, rather than give up the rights of self-government which we have reserved." It would take a personal visit from his close friend James Madison in September of 1799 to convince Jefferson to step off the ledge of extremism. And quite frankly, it saved probably his presidential aspirations in 1800. Madison is simply going to advise Jefferson not to intervene when the opposition is doing an adequate job of destroying itself. One of the core issues of the early republic was whether or not to support France, who had been going through its own revolution and eventual war with Great Britain. To Jefferson, this was a no-brainer. We have to support the French. He saw what was going on in France as the American Revolution on European soil. However, when Napoleon overturned the French Republic and declared himself the omnipotent military dictator, which is exactly what Adams predicted would happen, Jefferson will craftily reshift his stance to his now new reality. Jefferson wrote in 1800, "It is very material for the American people to be made sensible that their own character and situation are materially different from the French. And whatever may be the fate of republicanism there, we are able to preserve it inviolate or undamaged here." Again, this is exactly why Adams and before him Washington wanted to take a neutral stance in foreign policy, which Jefferson openly criticized them for, calling their neutral stance a violation of the spirit of 76. Jefferson was a masterful politician, although he might even argue that he wasn't one. But he was a masterful politician. He was like a chameleon. He could change colors on any issue so fluidly without the average voter even noticing that there was a shift. In the spring of 1800, the Federalists are going to nominate John Adams for re-election, as well as Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, a distinguished political figure from South Carolina. Now, what's interesting is the Federalists did not distinguish which person should be voted for in terms of the presidency. They just simply asked all Federalist electors to cast their votes for the Federalist nominees. Meanwhile, the Democratic Republicans nominated Thomas Jefferson of Virginia and Aaron Burr of New York, with Thomas Jefferson being their clear choice for president. The campaign that followed was nothing short of brutal. The Federalists will accuse Jefferson of being a godless, radical, revolutionary, a Jacobin, which was a reference to the most extreme faction of the French Revolution. They will argue that if Jefferson is elected president of the United States, this country will see a decay in its moral fabric. One accusation even said a Jefferson election will mean that murder and robbery and rape and incest will be taught and practiced in the United States. On the flip side, the Democratic Republicans are going to continue to label President Adams as a monarchist, someone who's trying to build a dynasty through his family. They will argue that he is undermining the Republican ideals of the American Revolution. In fact, one of the accusations argued that Adams was trying to plot to have his son married off to one of King George III's daughters, only to be thwarted by George Washington himself, who put on his old war uniform, sword in hand. One of the most bizarre and scathing accusations came from Republican writer James Callender, who had recently been arrested and sent to prison for being in violation of the Sedition Act. So naturally, he had an axe to grind with President Adams. He describes Adams this way: as a hideous hermaphroditical character, which has neither the force and firmness of a man, nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman. This was clearly a shot at not only Adams' masculinity, but it was deeper than that. This was a shot at Adams, who was often criticized during his administration for how much he relied on his wife, Abigail. He trusted her implicitly. He sought her advice on policy issues far more than he did his own Federalist cabinet. And let's not forget Alexander Hamilton, a fellow Federalist and frequent critic of John Adams. He will publish pamphlets criticizing President Adams, calling him emotionally unstable and unfit for the presidency. And while it's unclear whether or not this actually cost Adams any electoral votes, it certainly deepened the divide in that party. Hamilton will also allegedly try to get Pinckney to outpoll Adams, much like he tried in 1796, and just like in 1796, it will fall short. Despite the infighting, the Federalists were simply outmatched by the Democratic Republicans. Over the last 4 years, the Democratic Republicans had built a massive party machine, creating new newspapers and forming committees that were responsible for distributing campaign literature and coordinating campaign rallies, and their efforts paid off. This ushers in a new era of politics, killing off the version of politics that Washington and Adams embodied. In fact, Adams in 1800, after his defeat, wrote, "Jefferson had a party, Hamilton had a party, but the Commonwealth had none." When the electoral votes came in, Jefferson and Burr both received 73 votes, tying them for first place. Adams will come in third place with 65 votes, and coming in fourth will be Pinckney with 64 votes. Now, the tie between Jefferson and Burr is going to throw this election to the House of Representatives per the Constitution. And as we talked about in the last episode, per the Constitution, each state gets one vote in this situation. The problem is the House is divided. Over the next 5 days and 35 ballots, they can't decide who to elect. Half of the Federalists view Burr as more palatable than Jefferson. But then you have Alexander Hamilton, and his weight is heavy in that party. What he says usually goes. And Hamilton is going to influence a lot of the party members that, despite his disdain for Jefferson, he does not like Jefferson, but despite his disdain for Jefferson, he views Aaron Burr as an unprincipled opportunist and encourages his fellow Federalists to throw their votes to Jefferson. And so on the 36th ballot, Jefferson will win 10 states, Burr will win 4 states, and 2 states will abstain from voting. Now, it does seem that there was some bargaining done. Federalist House members will say that they reached out to the Jefferson camp and said, hey, we need you to promise to preserve some of these Federalist policies, and that Jefferson conceded and said he would, although Jefferson will say later that I never made any promises to the Federalists, although the Federalists will argue back and say, yeah, you did. The last 8 years between these former friends, now turned deeply entrenched political rivals, was volatile to say the least. But despite all of this, Abigail insisted that John have Jefferson over for cake and tea before she departed for Quincy, Massachusetts, a few weeks before the inaugural ceremony. Now, you talk about awkward, right? Now, there's no record of this conversation between the men and what was said, but to be a fly on that wall. On the day of the inauguration, Adams won't attend Jefferson's swearing in. He will take the 4 o'clock stagecoach back to Quincy, Massachusetts to join his wife. And these two men, after this little conversation that we have no record of, they will never speak again for 12 years. And towards the latter part of their life, they will begin to correspond via letter. And it looks as if, when you read these letters, that some of the fences had begun to be mended. Jefferson's victory marked a peaceful transfer of power for the first time in our country's history. And this is important to note, because there was a lot of uncertainty. Like, well, what's going to happen? Are they going to try to barricade themselves in the presidential mansion, which was still being constructed at this time? I mean, is he going to try to keep himself from being forced out? That did not happen. And despite the fact that Adams didn't show up for the inaugural ceremonies and all of that stuff, this marks an important moment in the early republic. The transfer of power from one party to another, something that the founders could have never imagined, because the party system was not even something that they even could fathom, right? This marks a big moment in American history. However, it's important to note that in the final days of Adams' administration, before Jefferson takes over, he's going to make several appointments to the judiciary system, and he's going to fill these with federal justices. This is historically known as the midnight judges, because Adams will make these appointments all the way up until the final moments of his administration. Some of the Adams appointments were to the Supreme Court. Guys like John Marshall, who he appointed Supreme Court Chief Justice. And Jefferson really didn't have an issue with some of those appointments, but he did take issue with some of the district court appointees. He felt like the Federalists were trying to entrench the judiciary system with all these Federalist justices, so he instructs his newly appointed Secretary of State, James Madison, to block some of these appointments, to not deliver some of these appointments. And when we say deliver these appointments, we're talking about actual documents. And one of the men who did not receive his appointment to one of the district courts was a guy by the name of William Marbury, and he's going to petition the Supreme Court to require James Madison to deliver those documents to him. This is going to lead to the Supreme Court case Marbury versus Madison, where Chief Justice John Marshall is going to be put in a very delicate situation that he will navigate through brilliantly. He will give the opinion of the court that William Marbury should have received his appointment. However, on the flip side, he's going to say that the section of the Judiciary Act of 1789 that gives the court the power to do so is unconstitutional. This establishes the precedent of judicial review in this country. And what that means is, as we've talked about in previous videos on our channel, the court has the ability to review law, and if the law is unconstitutional, they can strike it down. The Marbury decision is going to solidify the judiciary's role in being able to check the power of the other two branches, to co-equally exist among the branches of government. In closing, Jefferson's rise to the presidency in 1800 was marked by public discontent of a standing army, of elevated taxes and new taxes, as well as the Alien and Sedition Acts. It also marked a period where we're going to see a shift in the American political system. The politics of old, of Washington and Adams, are gone, and we're now entering into a new era of politics. Additionally, we see the peaceful transfer of power, despite how politically divided these two parties were and how ugly the campaign got. There was a peaceful transfer of power, and that speaks volumes, not only to the people living in the early republic, but it should speak volumes to us today in 2024. The election of 1800 is also going to lead to the adoption of the 12th Amendment in 1804, preventing a situation that we saw in 1800 where a president and his running mate are tied in the Electoral College. This election also sowed the seeds of a deadly feud between Hamilton and Burr, culminating in Burr fatally shooting Hamilton in 1804. The echoes of this bitter rivalry resonate throughout history, reminding us of the passions and stakes involved in the early days of the American Republic. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.